It was supposed to be a fun evening at the local carnival, the kind of place where the worst thing you'd expect to happen is getting sick from too much cotton candy. My friend Amanda and I had been looking forward to it all week. The colorful lights, the sounds of laughter and carnival games, and the thrill of the rides made it a perfect summer night. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the carnival coming alive with brilliant colors and sounds. We wandered through the rows of stalls and attractions, enjoying the festive atmosphere. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. While Amanda was playing one of the carnival games, I decided to take a stroll around the perimeter of the grounds. I needed a break from the noise and commotion. As I walked, I noticed a narrow path that led away from the carnival and into the nearby woods. The path was overgrown, but it was wide enough to see where it went. Curiosity got the better of me, so I ventured a little way into the woods, expecting to find a quiet spot to sit and collect my thoughts. As I walked, the sounds of the carnival faded behind me, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The air was cooler and smelled of pine. That's when I heard a soft, distant cry, like a child calling out. It was faint, almost lost in the rustle of the wind, but it was clear enough to make me stop in my tracks. I listened, my heart beginning to race. The sound came again, this time a little louder and more urgent. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush. The path was barely visible now, obscured by thick foliage and shadows. The cries grew louder as I went deeper into the woods, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I finally came upon a small clearing where the sound seemed to be coming from. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a small, decrepit playhouse, its paint chipped and faded. The door was slightly ajar, and the cries seemed to be coming from inside. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I was compelled to check. I approached the playhouse cautiously, the cries growing louder and more desperate. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly on its hinges. Inside, the playhouse was empty, save for a few old toys scattered around. The crying had stopped, and an uneasy silence fell over the clearing. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something odd, a single small footprint in the dust on the floor of the playhouse. It was recent, and it looked as if it had been made by a child's shoe. A shiver ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I glanced around, but there was no one else in sight. I backed out of the playhouse slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned to leave, I saw a shadow move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to make me freeze. I took a deep breath and hurried back down the path, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. When I finally emerged from the woods, the carnival lights were a welcome sight. I quickly found Amanda, who was waiting for me near the Ferris wheel. I told her what had happened, but she just shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks. Later, when we were back home, I did some research on the area. It turns out that the woods near the carnival had been the site of a tragic event years ago. A child had gone missing, and despite extensive searches, they were never found. The playhouse had been built by the carnival organizers as a memorial, but it had fallen into disrepair over the years. I'm not sure if I heard the cries of a lost child or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but that night left a lasting impression. I still don't know what I saw or heard in the woods, but I do know that I'll never venture into those woods again. Some things are better left undisturbed, and sometimes, the echoes of the past are best left in the shadows. It was a chilly October evening when my friends and I decided to spend the night at my aunt's old house. She had recently moved out, and the house was empty, perfect for a spooky adventure. My aunt had always told us eerie stories about the place, but we dismissed them as exaggerations until that night. The house was a classic old Victorian with creaky floors and long, dark hallways. We arrived in the late afternoon, the fading light casting eerie shadows through the tall windows. My friends, Lisa, Tom, and Jake, were all excited. We quickly set up in the large living room, where the fireplace crackled and provided a warm, inviting glow. After dinner, we decided to explore the house. My aunt's stories about strange noises and unexplained events intrigued us. The upstairs bedrooms were old and dusty, with antique furniture covered in white sheets. The atmosphere was perfect for a night of ghost stories. We gathered in one of the large bedrooms, and Jake suggested we play a game of truth or dare. The game was lighthearted until Lisa dared Tom to spend a few minutes alone in the attic. Tom, always the brave one, agreed without hesitation. The attic was accessible by a narrow staircase that led to a small, cluttered space filled with old trunks and forgotten knickknacks. Tom climbed up, and we heard the attic door creak shut behind him. We waited in the room below, our laughter and conversations muffled by the distance. After a few minutes, the house fell eerily silent. We were about to call Tom down when we heard a loud thump from the attic, followed by a series of soft, scratching noises. My heart raced. "What was that?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just Tom messing around," Jake said, trying to sound casual. We waited a few more minutes, but the noises continued. Unable to ignore it any longer, we decided to check on Tom. The attic door was slightly ajar when we reached it. The light from our flashlights barely cut through the darkness as we climbed the stairs. As we reached the attic, the air felt cold and heavy. We found Tom sitting in the middle of the room, looking pale and unnerved. "You okay?" I asked. Tom nodded but didn't speak. He pointed to a corner of the attic where a large, old mirror stood. The mirror was covered with a dusty sheet. The scratching noises seemed to come from behind it. Curious, Jake pulled the sheet off. The mirror's surface was grimy and distorted, but that wasn't what caught our attention. Behind the mirror, in the corner of the attic, we saw what looked like an old, small door one we hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. As we gathered around, Tom spoke up. "I heard whispers. They were coming from that door. I thought I saw shadows moving." Lisa shivered. "Maybe it's just an old storage space." But the whispers continued, faint but distinct, like a murmur from another world. We hesitated but decided to investigate. Jake pushed the door open a bit further, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The whispers grew louder, almost like soft voices talking directly into our ears. The passage was too tight for all of us to go in, so Tom and I squeezed through while Lisa and Jake stayed behind. The passage led to a small, hidden room, barely big enough for two people. The room was empty except for a few old, cobweb-covered boxes. The whispers stopped as soon as we entered the room. We looked around, trying to find the source of the sound. There was nothing unusual, just dust and old furniture. We decided to head back, still feeling unsettled. As we retraced our steps, the whispers started again, growing fainter as we moved away from the hidden room. When we got back to the main attic, Lisa and Jake were waiting anxiously. We told them what we had experienced, and while they were skeptical, they agreed that the night had been unsettling. We packed up and left the house, eager to put the night behind us. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. The whispers in the walls and the eerie atmosphere of that old Victorian house were undeniably chilling. Although nothing truly harmful happened to us, the experience left an indelible mark. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I wonder if there was something more to the house's history, a mystery that remains unresolved. I've always loved the woods behind my house. Growing up, they were my playground, a vast, tangled world of trees, streams, and hidden paths. Even as I got older, I found peace in wandering those woods, letting the sounds of nature drown out the noise of everyday life. But one night last summer, everything changed, and now I can't step foot in them without feeling a deep, gnawing fear. It was late August, and the night was unusually warm. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take a walk. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard, and the woods looked almost inviting in the silvery light. I grabbed a flashlight just in case, though I rarely used it. I knew those woods like the back of my hand. As I entered the tree line, the familiar scent of pine and earth filled my senses. The air was still, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt at ease, the stress of the day melting away with each step. I followed the usual path, one that wound deeper into the woods before circling back toward home. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. The woods, normally so alive with the sounds of insects and night birds, were eerily silent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. A shiver ran down my spine, and I told myself it was just the heat making everything feel off. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to finish my walk and get back to the safety of my home. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so soft and faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence. But then it came again, slightly louder, a hushed, unintelligible murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of life, just trees and shadows. My heart began to race, and I considered turning back, but curiosity got the better of me. I convinced myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal rustling in the underbrush. I continued on, but the whispers grew more frequent, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around me, circling me, growing louder with each step. It was as if the very trees were speaking, their voices low and sinister. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. Panic set in, and I turned around, heading back the way I came. But the whispers followed me, growing louder, more urgent. It felt like something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. Though I couldn't see anything when I looked over my shoulder, the path seemed longer than I remembered, twisting and turning in ways it never had before. I felt disoriented, like the woods were playing tricks on me, keeping me from finding my way out. The whispers turned into a cacophony, surrounding me, filling my head until I could barely think. I started to run, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. I didn't care about the path anymore, I just wanted to get out. The whispers chased me, rising to a deafening roar, and I could feel someone right behind me, reaching out. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods, the safety of my yard just beyond the trees. I burst through the undergrowth, the whispers stopping abruptly as I crossed into the moonlit clearing. I collapsed on the grass, my chest heaving, the silence of the night pressing in on me once more. I looked back at the woods, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the trees, swaying gently in the night breeze, as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just tried to swallow me whole. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? I still live in the same house, but I haven't set foot in those woods since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear whispers carried on the wind, calling me back. But I ignore them. I know better now. The woods are no longer my friend. Growing up, I had always been skeptical of ghost stories. My friends would share tales of haunted houses and eerie encounters, but I dismissed them as nonsense. I was the rational one, the one who believed there was always a logical explanation for the strange and unusual. That was until one night, when everything I thought I knew was turned upside down. It was a late autumn evening, and I was staying at my grandparents' house in the countryside. Their home was old, a creaky Victorian with tall windows and drafty halls. Despite its age, I had always found it cozy, a place filled with warmth and the smell of freshly baked bread. But that night, something felt different. The day had been unusually cold, and as the sun set, the temperature dropped even further. My grandparents had already gone to bed, leaving me alone in the living room with a book and a cup of tea. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but I barely noticed, lost in the pages of my novel. As the clock struck midnight, I decided it was time to head to bed. I turned off the lights, leaving only the dim glow of the hallway light to guide me up the stairs. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. It was then that I heard a soft, barely audible knock at the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who could be knocking at this hour? My grandparents lived in a remote area, with the nearest neighbor miles away. The thought of someone out there, in the middle of the night, unsettled me. I waited, hoping I had imagined it, but the knock came again, louder this time. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to go upstairs and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly unlocked the door and cracked it open. The wind rushed in, chilling me to the bone, but there was no one there. I leaned out, peering into the darkness, but the porch was empty. Confused, I closed the door and locked it again, double-checking the deadbolt. I was about to turn away when I heard the knock again. This time, it was coming from the back door. A cold wave of fear washed over me. There was no way someone could have moved from the front to the back so quickly. My mind raced through all the possibilities, but none of them made sense. I didn't want to check the back door, but I couldn't just ignore it either. Summoning all my courage, I walked through the darkened kitchen toward the back door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. I reached out to flick on the porch light, but the bulb fizzled and died, plunging the kitchen into complete darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, hand hovering over the light switch. Paralyzed by fear, I forced myself to move, grabbing the flashlight that my grandfather kept by the door. I shone it through the window, but once again, there was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything that could be knocking. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and slowly opened it. The the beam of the flashlight cutting through the night. The backyard was empty, the trees swaying in the wind. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. As I stepped back inside, something caught my eye, a faint, wet footprint on the kitchen floor. Panic surged through me. I hadn't gone outside yet, so how could there be a footprint? It was small, almost childlike, and led from the back door into the hallway. I followed the prints with the flashlight, my pulse racing as they continued down the hall and stopped abruptly at the bottom of the stairs. I stood there, staring at the last footprint, trying to make sense of it all. The house was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I was alone, there was no one else here. But as I stood at the base of the stairs, I felt it, a presence, something watching me from the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted up the stairs and into my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, then climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the wind howl outside, half expecting the knocking to start again, but it didn't. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, when I checked the kitchen, the footprints were gone, and my grandparents insisted they hadn't heard anything unusual. I never told them what happened that night. Part of me still wonders if I imagined it all, but deep down, I know what I felt. I've never been back to that house, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplained. They say the old house on Elm Street is haunted. As kids, we all dared each other to go inside, but no one ever really did except for that one time when I was 17. It was just before Halloween, and the thrill of a creepy adventure seemed more exciting than ever. My best friend Jake and I had always laughed off the ghost stories, so one evening, we decided to test our courage. The house had been abandoned for years, standing alone at the end of the street, its paint peeling and windows darkened with grime. We'd heard the rumors how a family had disappeared there decades ago, leaving the place to rot. Some claimed to see lights flickering inside at night, or hear faint voices when the wind blew just right. But we were rational guys, the kind who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. We arrived at the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with the damp, musty smell of autumn, and the wind had a bite that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. Jake grinned at me, his bravado masking the unease we both felt, ready to meet some ghosts. He joked, pushing open the rusty gate that groaned in protest. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone or something had left it that way. I hesitated for just a second before following Jake inside. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the house was even darker than it looked from the outside. The only light came from our flashlights, which cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. The living room was covered in dust, the furniture draped in yellowed sheets. It felt as though time had stopped here, everything frozen in place. We moved slowly, taking it all in, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. "Let's go upstairs," Jake suggested, already heading for the staircase. I followed, the old wood groaning under each step. The air grew colder as we climbed, and I noticed that my breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight at the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before us, lined with closed doors. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. Jake seemed unfazed, or at least he was good at pretending to be. He pushed open the first door on the left, revealing a small bedroom. The bed was made, as if someone had just left it that morning, and a thick layer of dust covered everything, including the old porcelain doll sitting on the dresser. Its eyes seemed to follow us as we moved around the room, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Let's check out the next room," I suggested, eager to leave the doll behind. Jake nodded, and we moved on, the door creaking loudly as we stepped back into the hallway. As we reached the second door, we both froze. There was a sound, a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. We looked at each other, wide-eyed, the bravado fading. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here," he whispered back, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. We turned to leave, but the door at the end of the hall slowly creaked open on its own. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was a faint glow coming from the room, and the whispering grew louder. Though I still couldn't make out any words, Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the stairs. We didn't wait to see what was in that room. We ran, the old house groaning and creaking as if it were alive, angry that we were leaving. We stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping over each other in our haste to get out. When we burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air felt like a slap in the face, bringing us back to reality. We didn't stop running until we were back on the street, panting and out of breath. We never spoke about what we heard or saw that night, and we never went back to the house. But sometimes, when I pass by it, I see that door at the end of the hallway in my mind, slowly opening on its own, and I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed just a little longer. I've always loved hiking, especially in the fall when the air is crisp and the leaves crunch underfoot. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, just me and my friend Sam, exploring a trail we'd never hiked before. We'd heard about these woods remote, and touched, and beautifully serene. Perfect for a couple of nature lovers like us. But as I sit here now, I can't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with that place. We started early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The trail was a narrow, winding path through dense forest, the trees towering over us like ancient sentinels. At first, everything was perfect. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground, and the only sounds were the rustling of the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. But as the day wore on, something changed. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the quieter it became. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you usually find in nature. It was an oppressive silence, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I could tell Sam felt it too. His usual chatter had stopped, and he kept glancing around, as if expecting to see something lurking behind the trees. "Do you feel that?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the stillness around us. Double quotes, yeah. I admitted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's just too quiet." We pressed on, but the sense of unease grew stronger with every step. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches twisting above us like skeletal fingers. And then we started hearing the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more distinct they became. Low, hushed voices, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out any words, but it was clear they were speaking to us, or about us. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear, and Sam did the same. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "Yeah," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to leave." We turned around, ready to retrace our steps, but the path behind us had changed. The trail we'd been following was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. It was as if the forest had swallowed the path, trapping us inside. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Let's just keep moving," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll find a way out." We continued walking, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt like they were closing in on us, coming from every direction. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches brushing against us as we passed. Suddenly, Sam grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. There, just off the trail, was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood rotting and the roof caving in. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It didn't belong there, and neither did we. "Let's go back," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to find a way out of here." But as we turned to leave, the whispers reached a fever pitch, almost drowning out my thoughts. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the whispers had been. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran. I don't know how long we ran or which direction we went, but we didn't stop until the trees finally began to thin, and we stumbled out of the woods, gasping for breath. When we reached the safety of the car, we didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. We both knew that something in those woods had been watching us, trying to keep us there. But we made it out, and we never spoke about it again. I still love hiking, but I'll never go back to those woods. There's something in there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. And I'm just grateful that we got out before we found out what it was. It was a crisp autumn evening when my best friend Jenna and I decided to stay at her family's old country house for a weekend getaway. The house had been in her family for generations, and while it was beautiful, it had always had a reputation for being a bit eerie. We'd heard countless stories about strange noises and unexplained events, but we laughed them off as superstitions. We arrived just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the sprawling lawn. Jenna's parents were out for the weekend, leaving us alone in the large, creaky house. We spent the evening exploring, setting up our sleeping bags in the cozy attic, and watching spooky movies. The attic was our favorite spot, a charming, dusty space filled with old trunks and forgotten memories. Around midnight, Jenna and I were lying in our sleeping bags, chatting and laughing about ghost stories, when we heard a soft, scraping noise coming from the far corner of the attic. I paused, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Jenna looked at me, her expression puzzled. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's probably just the house settling or something." The noise continued intermittently, scrape, scrape, scrape. I climbed out of my sleeping bag and tiptoed to the corner where the sound seemed to be coming from. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing unusual, just old boxes and cobwebs. "Probably just a mouse or something," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. We settled back into our sleeping bags, trying to ignore the unsettling noise. After a while, the sound stopped, and we managed to drift off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud thud. My heart raced as I sat up, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the attic. Jenna was still asleep, her breathing steady. I listened intently but heard nothing further. I tried to calm myself, attributing the noise to a branch tapping against the window or some other benign cause. But then, a shadow moved across the wall, dark and fleeting. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Jenna," I whispered urgently, shaking her shoulder. "Wake up," she stirred, her eyes blinking open. "What's wrong?" "There's something up here," I said, my voice trembling. I saw a shadow. We both sat up, our flashlight beams sweeping across the attic. The shadow was gone, but the air was thick with an oppressive silence. We scanned the room but found nothing out of place. Deciding it was best to check it out, we slowly made our way across the attic, the old floorboards creaking under our feet. We opened every trunk and inspected every box, finding nothing more sinister than old clothes and dusty knick-knacks. As we were about to give up and head back to our sleeping bags, Jenna noticed something strange, a small, antique mirror propped against the wall, half hidden behind a stack of old books. We hadn't seen it before, and it was covered in a thick layer of dust. "Maybe this is it," Jenna suggested, brushing off the dust. As she did, the mirror's surface revealed a faint, eerie reflection, a dark, swirling shape that seemed to move on its own. We both gasped, but as we wiped the mirror clean, the reflection returned to normal. We spent the rest of the night trying to rationalize what we had seen. It wasn't until dawn that we finally fell asleep, exhausted but relieved. The noises didn't return, and by morning, the house seemed perfectly ordinary. When Jenna's parents returned, we told them about our night. Her mother listened with a knowing smile. "Oh, that mirror," she said. "It's been in the family for ages. Some people say it's haunted, but nothing bad has ever happened. It just has a way of making people nervous." To this day, I still remember that night with a shiver. The house and its mysteries remain part of my memories, a reminder of how even the seemingly innocent can become unsettling in the right light. And though we didn't find anything truly sinister, the shadow and the eerie reflection left us with a lingering unease that we never quite shook. I'd always thought my old house was charming, creaky floors, antique furniture, the kind of place with character. My family had moved in years ago, and we'd all become accustomed to its quirks. That's why, when my friends came over for a sleepover, they were more excited than scared. Little did they know, my house had its own secret. It was a typical Friday night. We'd planned a movie marathon and a bunch of snacks. My friends Lisa, Mark, and Jen arrived around 7, and we spent the evening chatting, laughing, and catching up. By midnight, we were sprawled out in the living room, our eyes glued to the screen as the latest horror flick played. We were too engrossed in the movie to notice the time slipping away. Around 1 a.m., the film was just about to reach its climax when we heard a distinct, rhythmic knocking coming from the back door. It wasn't the random taps of wind or the house settling. It was deliberate and rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. I paused the movie and looked around at my friends. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Lisa nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, I heard it too. It's probably just the house settling." I tried to shake off the creeping unease. "I'll go check it out." I stood up and walked to the back door, trying to ignore the chill in the air. The knocking had stopped, but my pulse raced. I peered through the glass of the door but saw nothing unusual. The backyard was empty, the only light coming from the moon. I opened the door cautiously and stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. I shrugged it off as a branch or something bumping against the door and went back inside, locking it behind me. "Everything's fine," I said, trying to reassure everyone as I returned to the living room. "Probably just the wind." We continued the movie, but the knocking had shaken the group's mood. We were all on edge, the laughter and casual conversation replaced by nervous glances. About 15 minutes later, the knocking started again. This time it was louder and more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I felt my heart skip a beat. I looked at my friends, who were now visibly scared. Lisa's face was pale, and Mark and Jenna exchanged uneasy looks. "I'll check it again," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I went back to the door, but as soon as I reached it, the knocking stopped. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. Just as I was about to turn back inside, the knocking started again, this time coming from the window next to the door. Knock, knock, knocked out. I spun around, but there was no one there. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My friends were now huddled together, their faces reflecting their anxiety. I could hear their muffled voices, whispering about what could be causing the noise. I decided to call the police, just to be safe. As I was dialing, the knocking suddenly stopped. I kept the line open, my heart pounding, and waited for the police to arrive. They came quickly, patrolling the perimeter of the house and checking the area. After a thorough investigation, they found nothing out of the ordinary. They reassured us that it was probably just a prank or some kids messing around. They left, and although I was relieved, the unease remained. That night, as we finally tried to settle down, the knocking didn't return. We stayed up, talking about the strange occurrence and trying to make sense of it. The next morning, we discovered that a neighbor's cat had been prowling around the yard, and it had likely knocked against the door and window in its attempts to get inside. To this day, whenever I hear a knock at night, I can't help but remember that chilling experience. It was a night filled with fear and uncertainty, but thankfully, nothing more sinister came of it. Sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we can't quite explain, moments that leave us questioning the ordinary, even when we know we're safe. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a chance to escape the hustle of the city. My friends Sarah, Jake, and I had rented a small, remote cabin in the mountains. The cabin was charming and old-fashioned, with creaky floors and a fireplace that crackled warmly. We arrived on a Friday evening, the sun setting behind the trees. After unpacking and settling in, we spent the night playing board games and telling stories. Around midnight, Sarah suggested we explore the cabin's attic. It was something we hadn't thought to do yet, and the idea of a hidden, old attic intrigued us. The attic door was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. It was an old wooden door with a rusty padlock. We didn't have the key, but Jake, ever the resourceful one, managed to pry it open with a crowbar he found in the shed. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a dark, dusty space filled with old furniture and boxes. We fumbled around with our flashlights, exploring the attic. It was full of forgotten belongings, yellowed books, old clothing, and a collection of antique toys. Among the clutter, we found a peculiar wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate designs. It was locked, but like the attic door, it didn't seem old or rusty. The lock was a modern one, the kind you might find on a suitcase. Jake tried to open it with a hairpin, but it wouldn't budge. We were all curious about what might be inside, but after several attempts, we gave up and moved on. The attic didn't hold any other surprises, so we decided to head back downstairs and enjoy the rest of our evening. The next morning, we woke to the sound of the wind howling through the trees. It was a cold, overcast day. We spent the morning hiking nearby trails and returned to the cabin around noon. When we got back, we noticed something strange. The attic door was shut tight, and the padlock was back on. We all stared at the door, puzzled. None of us had touched it since the previous night. Jake tried to pry the door open again, but this time the padlock wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been reset somehow. We laughed off the odd occurrence, attributing it to some prank or a simple malfunction. Sarah suggested we take a look at the chest again, but when we went back to the attic, the chest was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, the dust disturbed as if something had been moved. That evening, we sat around the fireplace, talking about the day's events. The conversation inevitably drifted back to the attic and the strange happenings. We decided to take a break and head outside to enjoy the fresh air. As we stepped onto the porch, I glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving in the attic window. I shook off the feeling and joined my friends outside. We spent a few hours enjoying the cool mountain air and talking about everything from work to childhood memories. Later that night, as we were preparing for bed, we heard a loud bang from the attic. It was followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Jake, ever the brave one, volunteered to investigate. He took a flashlight and headed upstairs. We waited anxiously in the living room, our hearts pounding. After what felt like an eternity, Jake came back downstairs, looking pale but relieved. "There's nothing up there," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just some old junk. I think we're letting our imaginations run wild." We spent the rest of the night on edge but managed to get some sleep. The next morning, the padlock on the attic door was gone, and the door was slightly ajar. We decided not to investigate further and packed up to head back home. As we left the cabin, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We never did find out what caused the noises or why the attic door had locked itself. The chest was never found again, and the cabin's strange occurrences remained a mystery. To this day, when I think back on that weekend, I remember the eerie feeling of being watched and the unsettling noises from the attic. We survived the weekend, but the mystery of the locked room and the missing chest still lingers in my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. A few years ago, I decided to spend a quiet weekend at my family's old cabin in the woods. My friends Tom and Lisa were eager to join me. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from our busy lives, but it turned into something far more unsettling. The cabin was quaint, nestled deep in the forest, far from any neighbors. My family had owned it for decades, and while it was charming, it had a history of peculiar occurrences. I'd heard the story's strange noises at night, odd shadows flitting through the trees, but I always dismissed them as folklore. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun shining brightly through the trees. The cabin was as I remembered it, rustic, with a large fireplace and an old-fashioned charm. We spent the first evening settling in, cooking dinner, and catching up. The atmosphere was warm and friendly. Around midnight, we decided to play some board games by the fireplace. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the old cabin creaked and groaned as it settled. We were deep in a game when we heard a distinct knocking sound coming from the front door. Tom, sitting closest to the door, frowned. "Did anyone else hear that?" We all stopped and listened. The knocking came again, steady and rhythmic, like someone tapping with a deliberate pattern. My pulse quickened, but I tried to stay calm. "It's probably just the wind," I suggested. Tom got up and checked the door. There was no one outside. We laughed it off, attributing it to the wind or some animal, and returned to our game. But the knocking continued intermittently. Every few minutes. By 2 a.m., we were all on edge. Lisa was visibly shaken, her eyes darting to the door every time the knocking sounded. "Maybe we should just go to bed," she said. We agreed. I locked the front door and we headed to our rooms, trying to shake off the unease. As I lay in bed, the knocking started again, soft and persistent. It seemed to be coming from the side of the cabin this time. Unable to ignore it any longer, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. The night air was cold and damp, and the moon cast eerie shadows through the trees. I walked around the cabin, but there was nothing unusual, no signs of anyone or anything out of place. The knocking had stopped as soon as I stepped outside. Returning to the cabin, I found Tom and Lisa waiting anxiously. "It's nothing," I said, though I wasn't completely convinced. "Just some weird noises." We managed to sleep through the rest of the night, though it was fitful and filled with strange dreams. In the morning, we examined the cabin more closely. The door and windows were all secure, and there were no signs of tampering. That day, we decided to hike the trails around the cabin, hoping to clear our heads and forget about the previous night. We spent the afternoon exploring and enjoying the fresh air. When we returned, the cabin was quiet. As we were preparing dinner, Lisa noticed something odd. The old rocking chair on the porch, which had been empty all day, was now gently rocking back and forth. The wind had died down, and there was no breeze to explain the movement. Tom and I exchanged uneasy glances. We couldn't figure out how the chair had started rocking, but we decided not to dwell on it. We spent the rest of the evening chatting and laughing, trying to ignore the lingering unease. That night, we didn't hear any more knocking. We slept soundly, and when we woke up, we packed up and headed home. The experience left us unsettled, but nothing bad had happened, and we all made it through the weekend without incident. To this day, I can't explain the knocking or the rocking chair. The cabin remains a place of strange memories, a reminder that some things can't be easily explained. We survived our weekend, but the eerie noises and the inexplicable events are a chilling reminder of the mysteries that sometimes lurk in the shadows. A few years ago, I was living alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It was a quiet, unremarkable place, the kind of place you'd forget the moment you left. But one night, something happened that I can't forget. It started on a chilly autumn evening. I had just finished dinner and was lounging on the couch, reading a book. The street outside was dark, the kind of dark that only comes from living in a place with few streetlights. My apartment was on the top floor of a 3-story building, and it was eerily silent. Around 10 p.m., I heard a faint noise from the hallway. It was a light, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking with a limp or dragging a shoe. I ignored it at first, assuming it was someone in the building or maybe even just the old pipes. But as the minutes passed, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. I decided to investigate. I walked out of my apartment and down the dimly lit hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallway was empty, the tapping had stopped, and all I could hear was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I checked each door, no one was around, and everything seemed normal. I returned to my apartment, puzzled but dismissing the noise as a figment of my imagination. I tried to return to my book, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Every so often, I would hear the tapping again, this time more sporadic, and from different directions. I decided to ignore it and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The tapping persisted, and now it sounded like it was coming from inside my apartment. I got up to check, but again, I found nothing out of the ordinary. By morning, I was exhausted. I dismissed the night's events as stress or a bad dream and went about my day. But the tapping started again that night. It was more intense now, coming from all around me, above, below, and beside. It felt like something was trying to get my attention. I resolved to find the source of the sound. I spent the next few days meticulously checking every possible cause. I looked into the walls, checked for pests, and even asked the landlord if any work was being done that might cause noise. Everything checked out fine. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, I was sitting in the living room when the tapping started up again. This time, it was louder and more rhythmic, almost like it was following a pattern. My heart raced as I walked to the hallway, determined to confront whatever was causing it. As I stepped into the hallway, the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence was unnerving. I stood there, listening, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, a dark, indistinct shape moving along the wall at the end of the hallway. It wasn't a person, but something more amorphous and shifting. It moved in and out of view, as if it was slipping through the walls. I was frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, and I could feel a cold chill running down my spine. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. I turned on every light in the apartment and stayed awake the rest of the night. The tapping never returned, the shadow never reappeared. I felt like I had crossed some unseen boundary, and whatever was there had retreated. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Was it a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress? I couldn't be sure, but the tapping and the shadow were never seen again. I moved out of that apartment not long after. I never did find out what caused the tapping or the shadow, but the experience left me with an eerie sense of unease. I survived the encounter, but to this day, I can't help but feel that something unseen was trying to reach out to me from the shadows. It was a chilly October evening when I decided to visit my grandmother's old house. She'd passed away a few months prior, and I needed to clear out some of her belongings. The house, a creaky Victorian on the outskirts of town, was filled with memories and things that had accumulated over the years. As I sorted through dusty boxes in the attic, I came across an old, ornate mirror covered with a moth-eaten sheet. The mirror was intricately framed with swirling patterns of silver and gold, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I felt a shiver of excitement and unease. My grandmother had always been a superstitious woman who believed that old objects held secrets. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to uncover the mirror. I pulled off the sheet, and the glass seemed to pulse slightly, reflecting the dim light from the single bulb overhead. The frame was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the way the glass seemed to draw me in. As I continued my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me. Every now and then, I would glance at it and see fleeting shadows move within the reflection, though the attic behind me remained empty. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to tired eyes and the dim lighting dot around midnight. I decided to call it a night. I turned off the light and was about to head downstairs when I heard a faint creaking noise. It came from the attic, like someone stepping lightly across the wooden floor. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone else in the house. I turned back towards the attic, the only light now coming from the moon filtering through a small window. I approached the mirror, and as I did, I saw a shadow dart across the reflection. It was brief, but it was unmistakable, a figure moving quickly behind me. I spun around, but the attic was empty. My nerves were on edge. I approached the mirror again, and as I did, the reflection seemed to ripple. The figure in the mirror looked like a dark silhouette, and it moved as if trying to escape from the glass. I took a deep breath and rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just my imagination. Determined to prove that there was nothing wrong, I snapped a few photos of the mirror with my phone. When I checked the photos, my breath caught in my throat. In each image, the figure was more defined, a tall, dark shape that seemed to be pressing against the glass. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I couldn't explain it. The house was old, and perhaps there were drafts or reflections causing odd shapes. Still, I decided to cover the mirror and leave the attic. As I packed up my things, I heard the creaking again, this time louder and closer. I quickly descended the stairs, locking the attic door behind me. I spent the rest of the night downstairs, feeling like I was being watched. The next morning, I returned to the attic with a friend to help me finish clearing out the house. We both felt uneasy as we moved around, but nothing unusual happened. The mirror was still covered, and there were no more strange noises. We finished the work and decided to leave the mirror in the attic. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was better left alone. As we drove away, I glanced back at the old house. It looked quiet and still, but a part of me wondered about the secrets it still held. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that mirror. The figure, the shadows, it all seemed too real to be just a trick of the light. But the house is gone now, sold to new owners who probably have their own stories to tell. All I know is that sometimes, it's best not to uncover what lies hidden in the dark corners of the past. A few years ago, I was house-sitting for a friend who lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house itself was charming but had an eerie reputation among the locals. They whispered about strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena, but I didn't put much stock in such stories. I was simply doing a favor for a friend. It was late October, and a cold front had settled in. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in around it. My friend had left me with instructions to keep the house secure and to take care of the plants. It was a straightforward job, so I settled in for what I expected to be a quiet, uneventful week. The first night passed without incident. I made sure to lock all the doors and windows before heading to bed. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. Heart pounding, I fumbled for the light switch. The house was silent once more. I convinced myself it was just the old house settling, maybe a branch tapping against the window. The next day, everything seemed normal. I went about my chores, checked the plants, and even explored the attic, which was filled with old furniture and boxes. There was something oddly captivating about the place, but nothing out of the ordinary. That evening, while reading a book in the living room, the lights began to flicker. I thought it was a problem with the old wiring, so I went to check the circuit breaker in the basement. The basement was damp and musty, with spider webs in every corner, but the breaker seemed fine. I reset it and went back upstairs. As soon as I was back in the living room, the flickering resumed. It was intermittent at first, but it grew more erratic. I turned off all the lights, convinced it was just a malfunction, and decided to turn in early. The darkness was unsettling, but I felt more at ease with the lights off. Around midnight, I was awoken by a strange sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the second floor. I got up, flashlight in hand, and climbed the stairs. The sound seemed to come from the hallway. I walked cautiously down the hall, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The thumping stopped abruptly, and the hallway was eerily quiet. I checked every room, finding nothing out of place. The old grandfather clock in the hallway was still, its pendulum unmoving. As I turned to leave, I saw it. A shadow darted across the end of the hall, moving too quickly to be a trick of the light. My heart skipped a beat. I raced back downstairs and locked myself in the living room. The flickering lights had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat on the couch, eyes darting around the room, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I called my friend to report the strange occurrences. She laughed it off, saying the house had quirks and old wiring. She mentioned something about a previous tenant who had also complained of weird noises and flickering lights, but nothing ever came of it. I spent the rest of my time there on edge, but nothing else unusual happened. The flickering lights and odd sounds never returned. I finished my duties and left the farmhouse behind, vowing never to house sit in that place again. The experience left me with an uneasy feeling. I still don't know what caused the lights to flicker or the strange thumping noises. Maybe it was the old house settling or the creaks and groans of an ancient structure. Or maybe, as the locals suggested, it was something more unsettling that had been waiting in the shadows. Whatever the case, the farmhouse remains one of the eeriest places I've ever been, and I've never been so relieved to leave a house behind. Last summer, I had to spend a week at my aunt's old house while she was away on vacation. The house was charming but had an unsettling air about it. It was built in the 1920s and had that classic old house creakiness. Every step seemed to echo through the empty halls. I settled in on a Friday afternoon. My aunt had left me instructions to keep the place in order and check the mail. I found the attic key tucked inside a drawer. She had mentioned it in passing, saying it was full of old family keepsakes. I wasn't particularly interested in the attic. I just needed to keep the house in good shape. The first night was quiet. I watched TV and went to bed early, feeling a bit uneasy about being alone in the large house. Around midnight, I was woken by a loud thud coming from the attic. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a stray animal on the roof. The thudding continued intermittently, and each time I tried to ignore it, it grew louder. Eventually, I got up, flashlight in hand, and headed towards the attic. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and I could hear the sound clearly now, a rhythmic banging that seemed to be coming from directly above me. I reached the attic door, hesitated for a moment, then unlocked it. The door groaned open, and I shined my flashlight into the dark space. The attic was filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and cobwebs. The source of the noise was nowhere to be seen. I scanned the area, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Just as I was about to turn back, the thudding stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine. The attic was eerily silent. I moved cautiously through the clutter, shining my flashlight everywhere. As I was inspecting an old trunk, I noticed something peculiar, a faint glow coming from behind a stack of boxes. I moved the boxes aside and found an old radio sitting atop a dusty shelf. The radio was on, but the dial was static, and the noise seemed to come from the radio itself. The thudding wasn't coming from the radio, but the radio's presence made the whole situation more unnerving. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, the static on the radio began to crackle and change. I heard a garbled voice, barely audible but unmistakably human. The voice was filled with static, and although I couldn't make out the words, it sounded like someone was trying to speak to me from far away. I quickly turned off the radio and took a few deep breaths. My hands were shaking as I put the radio back on the shelf and started heading back downstairs. The house was still and quiet once more. I locked the attic door behind me and decided to call it a night. The next morning, I asked the neighbors if they knew anything about the house or the attic. One of them, an elderly woman, mentioned that the house had a history of strange occurrences. She told me that the previous owners had reported odd noises, but no one ever figured out what caused them. The house had been quiet for years, and no one had reported anything unusual recently. My aunt returned the following week, and I told her about the noises and the radio. She shrugged it off, saying it was probably just old wiring or a loose connection in the attic. She promised to have it checked out. I never did find out what caused the noises or the strange radio interference. The house remained as charming as ever, and the incidents never repeated during my stay. To this day, I think about that old radio and the unsettling feeling I had while I was alone in that house. It remains one of the eeriest experiences I've ever had, but I'm grateful nothing worse came of it. A few years ago, my friend Jessica asked me to house sit while she was away on a business trip. Her home was a charming old Victorian house in a small town, and I was happy to help. She mentioned that the house had some quirks but assured me it was safe. Little did I know, the quirks would soon become a terrifying reality. The first couple of days were uneventful. I enjoyed the old-world charm of the house, from the creaky wooden floors to the vintage furniture. One night, while I was exploring the house, I discovered a small, dusty door hidden behind a bookshelf in the library. It was barely noticeable and had no handle, just a keyhole. Curiosity got the better of me. I searched the house for a key but found nothing that fit. I told myself it was just an old storage closet and didn't think much more about it. But the door began to haunt my thoughts. On the third night, I was sitting in the library reading a book when I heard a faint scratching noise coming from behind the hidden door. I froze, listening intently. The scratching continued intermittently, as if something or someone was trying to get out. My heart raced. I told myself it was just an old pipe or the house settling, but the scratching grew louder and more persistent. The noise was so unnerving that I found it hard to concentrate on anything else. I decided to investigate further. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the hidden door. The scratching stopped as soon as I approached. I felt a wave of cold air rush from the crack as I shone the flashlight around, trying to see if there was any movement. The door was tightly shut with no visible way to open it. The following day, I asked a local handyman to check it out. He tried to pry the door open but couldn't find anything unusual. He suggested it might just be an old door frame that had warped over time, causing the noises. He left, and I was left alone with my mounting fear. That night, the scratching started again. I felt compelled to confront it. Armed with a screwdriver and my flashlight, I tried to force the door open. It didn't budge. The scratching grew more frantic, and my anxiety escalated. Just as I was about to give up, the scratching abruptly stopped. A heavy silence followed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped back, and with a trembling hand, I touched the door. It felt unnervingly cold, almost as if it were radiating an otherworldly energy. I decided to take a break and went to the kitchen to calm down. As I was making a cup of tea, I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. I quickly went up to check but found nothing out of place. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the top of the stairs. The rest of the night was uneventful. I stayed in the library, keeping an eye on the hidden door, but the scratching did not return. When Jessica returned, I told her about the door and the noises. She seemed unsurprised and told me that it was a known quirk of the house, and that it was probably just old pipes or some other mechanical issue. She mentioned that the door had been there for years, and that no one had ever been able to figure out what it led to. Even after Jessica returned, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling I had while I was alone in the house. The scratching noise and the hidden door remained a mystery, but at least I had survived the experience without any harm. The house went back to being just a charming old home, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I've never forgotten the sense of dread I felt that night, and it remains one of the eeriest experiences of my life. A few years ago, I agreed to help my friend Sarah clean out her grandmother's old house. Sarah's grandmother had recently passed away, and the house had been left untouched for years. It was a large, Victorian-style home, full of antique furniture and dusty rooms. The sort of place you'd see in a horror movie, but I didn't expect anything truly unsettling. We began on a Saturday morning, tackling the main floor first. The house had a musty smell and seemed to groan with every step we took. We were making good progress when we discovered a small door in the back of a closet. It was barely noticeable and seemed to lead to a tiny, dark room. "Let's check it out," Sarah suggested. I agreed, though I was a bit uneasy about what we might find. We pried the door open and were greeted by a narrow, dimly lit space filled with old trunks and forgotten items. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sarah and I started sifting through the contents, finding old photographs, letters, and dusty knick-knacks. As we sorted through the items, I noticed a small, ornate box tucked in the corner of the room. It was intricately carved with patterns I couldn't quite make out. I picked it up, noticing how cold it felt despite the warmth of the day. The box was locked, and there was no key in sight. "Look at this," I said to Sarah, showing her the box. She examined it briefly and shrugged. "Probably just another old keepsake," she said. We decided to put it aside and focus on clearing the room. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. The atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive as the light faded. The old house seemed to settle and creak with each passing minute. Sarah went to make us some coffee while I continued working in the hidden room. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering. It was barely audible but seemed to come from all around me. I froze, straining to catch the words. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and unintelligible. I scanned the room, but there was no one else there. The whispering grew louder and more urgent, causing my heart to race. I called out for Sarah, but she didn't respond. The whispering continued, now accompanied by a faint rustling sound, like paper being shuffled. I turned on my flashlight and began to search the room more thoroughly, trying to find the source of the noise. The whispers stopped abruptly. I felt a cold draft and noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped significantly. The air felt heavy, and a shiver ran down my spine. I was about to leave the room when I noticed something strange about the ornate box. It seemed to have moved slightly from where we had left it. I approached the box cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispering started again, more insistent now, as if it was trying to get my attention. I decided to open the box, hoping it would reveal some logical explanation for the noises. With a deep breath, I pried the box open. Inside, I found old, yellowed letters and some old coins. Nothing seemed unusual except for a peculiar old photograph of a woman with a stern expression. I felt an odd sense of familiarity, but I couldn't place it. Just then, Sarah returned with the coffee. Seeing me standing in the small, cluttered room, she immediately asked, "What's going on?" I told her about the whispering and the cold draft. Sarah, though skeptical, agreed that we should finish up for the day. We packed up the items and locked the small room behind us. Later, when we recounted the events to Sarah's family, they were surprised. They mentioned that Sarah's grandmother had always been very secretive about certain parts of the house, especially the small room. They had never heard of any unusual occurrences, but were intrigued by our experience. Despite the eerie encounter, nothing particularly dangerous happened. We survived the experience and never encountered the whispers again. The old house remained as charming and mysterious as ever, but I've never forgotten the chilling whispers in that hidden room. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, but I was relieved that we all made it through without any harm. It was during my junior year of college when my friends and I decided to take a weekend camping trip. We chose a remote spot in the woods near an old, abandoned summer camp, a place known for its eerie history. The camp had been closed for decades, and rumors of hauntings were a local legend. Naturally, this made it the perfect spot for our adventure. We arrived at the campsite on a Friday afternoon. There were 5 of us, me, my roommate Jake, and our friends Emma, Lisa, and Mark. The day was bright and clear, and we set up our tents and started a fire with high spirits. We joked about the camp's spooky reputation and made plans to explore the old buildings the next day. As night fell, we huddled around the fire, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. The camp's dilapidated buildings loomed in the distance, casting long shadows in the moonlight. Around midnight, the forest grew quiet, and an unsettling calm settled over us. Mark suggested we investigate one of the old cabins to add some thrill to our night. The cabin was about 100 yards from our campsite. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way through the underbrush, our beams cutting through the darkness. The cabin, once a lively place, was now just a rotting skeleton of its former self. The wooden planks creaked and groaned as we stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beams, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. We explored the cabin's main room, which was filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. There was nothing particularly alarming, just the usual decay of an old and used building. We were about to leave when Emma noticed something odd, a set of scratches on the wooden floor near the fireplace. "Guys, look at this," she said, pointing at the marks. They looked as if someone had tried to move a heavy object, but there was nothing in that spot except dust and debris. We shrugged it off as the work of vandals or animals and continued exploring. Just then, Lisa's flashlight flickered and went out. She cursed under her breath and fumbled with the batteries. As she worked to fix it, the rest of us continued to examine the cabin. Suddenly, a low whisper echoed through the cabin. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone was speaking just out of reach. I glanced around, trying to locate the source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but we all tried to remain calm. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, like hidden voices trapped within the old wood. The temperature dropped noticeably, and an icy draft swept through the cabin. We huddled together, our breath visible in the cold air. Jake, trying to lighten the mood, suggested we leave and head back to the campfire. As we made our way out, Lisa's flashlight finally flickered back to life. We hurried back to our campsite, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to us. The rest of the night was uneventful. We sat around the fire, talking about our experience and trying to rationalize what we had heard. Everyone was a bit on edge, but we managed to enjoy the rest of the evening. The next morning, we decided to explore the camp's other buildings before packing up. The sun was bright, and the woods seemed much less ominous in the daylight. We found old cabins, a decaying mess hall, and a rusted playground. The camp had been abandoned for so long that nature had reclaimed much of it. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, we all agreed that the experience from the previous night was unsettling but harmless. There were no signs of anything supernatural, just old buildings and our overactive imaginations. We left the camp with a mixture of relief and disappointment, having survived a night filled with whispers and shadows. The old summer camp remained a fascinating and eerie memory, but it was a reminder of the power of suggestion and the thrill of the unknown. Despite the unsettling experience, we all made it through unscathed, and the campfire stories of our adventure only added to the thrill of our next camping trips. It was a cool October night when I decided to visit my old college friend, Mia, who had just moved into a historic house on Hawthorne Street. The house was a charming Victorian structure, complete with creaky floors and a sprawling porch. It was perfect for a Halloween visit. The kind of house that seemed like it belonged in a ghost story, but Mia insisted it was just the right amount of spooky and charming. Mia was hosting a small get-together to celebrate her new home, so I arrived around 8 p.m. The house was already bustling with friends and laughter. The warm light from the old-fashioned lamps created a cozy atmosphere, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. It was a classic Halloween night, complete with pumpkin decorations and a roaring fireplace. After a few hours of catching up and enjoying the festive spirit, Mia suggested we take a tour of the house. She led us through each room, sharing anecdotes about the house's history. It was during this tour that I noticed something odd. Every room we entered had an antique mirror on one wall, each with a different ornate frame. The mirrors were old, their glass slightly foggy, but they added to the house's charm. We finally reached the attic, which Mia described as her favorite part of the house. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. We joked about finding hidden treasures or maybe even ghosts, and the group laughed. Mia was excited to show us an old mirror she had just moved up there. As Mia uncovered the mirror, I noticed it was different from the others. It had a tarnished silver frame with intricate carvings that seemed almost unsettling. The glass was clearer than the other mirrors, and as I looked into it, I could see faint, shadowy shapes moving in the background. I brushed it off as a trick of the light. The group spent some time in the attic, reminiscing and joking. When I looked at the mirror again, the shadows seemed more pronounced. They appeared to shift and writhe as if something was trying to emerge from the glass. My friends, caught up in their conversation, didn't notice that suddenly the temperature in the attic dropped, and I felt an uneasy chill. The old wooden beams creaked, and the house seemed to settle with a low groan. I turned to the group, trying to mask my discomfort. I was about to say something when the attic light flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. In the dim light of our phones, I glanced back at the mirror. The shadows were gone, but the mirror's surface now seemed to ripple like disturbed water. I felt a surge of anxiety but tried to stay calm. Mia and the others seemed unfazed, chatting and searching for a flashlight. Just then, the light came back on, and the mirror looked normal again. I was relieved but still unnerved. I decided to stay quiet about what I had seen. After a bit more exploring, we all headed back downstairs to rejoin the party. As the night went on, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. The mirrors around the house seemed to follow me with their reflections, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I avoided the attic for the rest of the night, trying to focus on enjoying the party. Around midnight, the party began to wind down. My friends and I decided to leave, thanking Mia for the wonderful evening. As I walked out the front door, I took one last look at the house. The windows seemed darker now, and I felt a strange, lingering chill. The next day, I called Mia to check in and see how she was doing. She mentioned that the mirrors had all been cleaned and polished, and she had decided to move the antique mirror from the attic to the living room. I didn't tell her about the shadows I had seen or the strange feeling in the attic. Mia still lives in that house, and she often tells stories about its quirks and history. Despite the oddities, she assures everyone that nothing truly sinister has ever happened. I sometimes wonder about that mirror and the shadows I saw, but I prefer to keep it as a mysterious memory. The night was eerie and unsettling, but nothing truly bad happened to any of us. We all left the house unharmed, though the experience left me with an unsettling feeling I couldn't quite shake. It was a crisp fall evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to Willow Creek, a picturesque spot known for its serene environment and rumored haunted history. We had heard whispers about the old bridge by the creek, said to be a site of mysterious occurrences. Naturally, we were intrigued. The group consisted of myself, Mark, Sarah, and Jason. We arrived just as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The air was cool, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Willow Creek was as beautiful as we had imagined, with its clear water flowing over smooth stones and surrounded by dense woods. After setting up a small campfire near the creek, we decided to explore the area. We followed a narrow path leading to the old wooden bridge that spanned the creek. The bridge was an antique, with weathered planks and iron railings covered in creeping vines. It creaked under our weight as we crossed it, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We stopped in the middle of the bridge, admiring the view and joking about the ghost stories we had heard. Sarah, always the skeptic, laughed off the tales of hauntings as nothing more than local legends. Mark and Jason shared their own exaggerated ghost stories, and the atmosphere was light and playful. As we prepared to head back to our campfire, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. The once warm evening air turned chilly, and an eerie silence fell over the area. The rustling of the leaves ceased, and even the creek's gentle murmur seemed to vanish. The abrupt change made the hairs on my arms stand on end. We began to hear faint whispers, almost as if someone was talking in hushed tones right next to us. The sound was indistinct, but it seemed to be coming from the woods surrounding the bridge. We all fell silent, straining to hear more clearly. The whispers grew louder, but still remained unintelligible. Jason suggested it was just the wind playing tricks on us. He tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but his usual enthusiasm was absent. We decided to leave the bridge and return to the warmth of the campfire, but as we turned, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was almost deafening, and the contrast was jarring. Back at the campfire, we all felt a bit on edge. We tried to dismiss the whispers as nothing more than our imaginations running wild. We chatted about our favorite scary movies and roasted marshmallows, but the unnerving feeling lingered. As the night wore on, Mark decided to go for a short walk to clear his head. We warned him to be careful, given the spooky ambience, but he waved off our concerns. Sarah and I stayed by the fire, while Jason decided to follow Mark at a distance. After a few minutes, Jason returned looking visibly shaken. He said he had seen a shadowy figure moving in the distance and had heard the whispers again. Mark, however, returned shortly after, having seen nothing unusual. We all decided it was time to call it a night. As we packed up and headed to our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers had stopped, but the eerie silence seemed to press in on us. We huddled in our tents, trying to get some rest. The next morning, we packed up and left Willow Creek, each of us exchanging uneasy glances. We talked about our experience, and while we were all unnerved, we agreed that nothing truly harmful had happened. The whispers remained a mystery, a chilling reminder of the night we spent at Willow Creek. To this day, the memory of that night lingers with me. The whispers and sudden silence still send shivers down my spine. Though we all made it through without any harm, the experience was a stark reminder of how the unknown can unsettle even the most rational minds. The beauty of Willow Creek was undeniable, but so was the strange and unsettling atmosphere that accompanied it.